Hey, it's Dr. Shante, and today I'm coming to you with a very serious topic. Trauma is uncomfortable. It's something that a lot of people don't want to talk about and quite honestly would prefer to bury in their past and leave it right there. But on this episode, I'm going to explain why more of us should be talking about trauma, especially if we're in the African American community. Keep watching. So before I get started, I want to thank you so much for dropping by my channel. There are so many other options on YouTube and you chose to stop right here. So if you find value in this episode, make sure that you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel and turn on those post notifications so that you are notified every single time I post new content. So let's get to the matter at hand. So in my last video, I talked about how I was going to be launching a new podcast called Whole and Complete. So that has happened. It happened a couple of weeks ago, and I set a modest expectation. I said, if I can get 500 downloads in the first month, that is really good because it means that we're off to a good start, that it's building momentum, and I can grow from there. Well, we passed that after 3 days, and we've tripled and quadrupled that at this point. People have responded so amazingly well to that podcast. And so if you have been a part of that, thank you so much. It's been life-changing, not just for me, but also for the listeners. But you don't have to believe me. You can read the reviews that are already coming in. It's just been such a blessing to see God move in that space. So thank you so much. And the first series in the podcast is about spiritual cancer. And spiritual cancer is when we have allowed things in our past experiences, hurts, pains to fester in our spirit, and they begin to grow and metastasize and poison our relationships, our communication, our feelings about who we are, and our own sense of self. And more times than not, because it's painful, our natural tendency is to bury it. But I'm going to make a case for why we need to stop doing that, especially in the African American community. Before I begin, I want to make it very clear. This is not a sweeping generalization of all African Americans or all Black people, because all Black people don't experience the world the same. We come from different families. We come from different backgrounds. And so I want to be very clear that this isn't an indictment of all Black people, but this happens enough and it happens so much that I felt the need to speak up about it. And in doing so, to facilitate the healing process for someone who might need it. So I can't speak for you, but in my family, in my culture, the experience has been that what happens in the household stays in the household. You do not talk about what happens in this house outside of this house. Otherwise, the consequences are very severe. You just don't do it. You don't expose hurt, you don't expose drama, you don't expose trauma, because that is a violation of the code in the family. You just don't do that. And so what that means is that when you experience trauma, whether it's abuse, whether it's neglect, whether it is put downs or what have you, when you experience those types of things, we've been conditioned to just suck it up, to just soldier on, to just keep it moving. And in doing that, we are conditioning ourselves. We're conditioning our children. For generations, we've been conditioned not to speak up when we're hurt, not to self-advocate. And that becomes so toxic in adulthood, because when you are traumatized, and what trauma is, it's a stress, okay? So when you are traumatized and your body and your psyche goes into fight, flight, or freeze, or fear or panic, or you don't know when you're going to eat, or you don't know what kind of parent you're going to be walking into if they are a drug abuser or anything like that, your body remembers that trauma. Your mind remembers that trauma. And so even though time goes on and years may pass, if you have not resolved that, if you have not healed that, it stays with you, and it manifests itself in so many toxic ways, in diabetes, in high blood pressure, in heart attack, and stress. And when we are stressed, if we can't speak the trauma, then we do things like eat the trauma, or we drink the trauma, or we tranquilize or medicate the trauma, or we sex the trauma. Anything to take away the stinging and the sensation of that trauma not being healed. And this is so detrimental to the African American community because not only have we been conditioned in a lot of ways not to speak on what happens outside the house, but we've also been conditioned to stay in our lane. You know, the Bible says that we are our brother's keeper, and we don't do that like we used to. We don't do that anymore. Everybody's like, do you, boo? Or, you know, that ain't none of my business, or I got my own problems. And because we become so isolated and so fragmented, and things like social media make us so disconnected. You know, just because you are friends with somebody on social media doesn't mean that you know how they're actually doing, doesn't mean that you know how they're actually feeling. Everybody can put up a happy picture or a smiling face and make it seem like, you know, life is wonderful. But at this point, we know better than that. And because we've been conditioned to suffer in silence, we don't want to expose people in our families that may have done us wrong, or we don't want to expose, you know, the fact that maybe our parents were not the best parents they could be. Now, it's not about demonizing. It's not about calling out. It's not about fracturing relationships with family members, but we can't be so consumed with shame. We can't be so consumed with appearances. We can't be so consumed with what other people are going to think that we're willing to sacrifice ourselves, sacrifice our mental health, our spiritual health, our ways of communicating and facilitating a healthy lifestyle just to protect someone else's feelings. That is a toxic dynamic that we have to stop. On the podcast, I listed some specific signs and indicators that there may be a trauma present that hasn't been resolved. And so if you are the type of person where you find yourself, it's hard to trust people, or you find it hard to ask for help, or you're not willing to let people help you, if you struggle to be vulnerable, if you find yourself hustling for acceptance, meaning you're always the person that's like, let's do this or let's do that, or I'll pay, or, you know, no, you can stay with me, because you are afraid of rejection, or fearful that you're not enough, or that if you don't comply, or that if you don't volunteer, or that you don't perform, then, you know, you're going to be rejected in some way if you isolate yourself from people. And so you're very closed off, and you're very guarded, and, you know, you have walls up, and you really don't let people in, or you struggle to be vulnerable with people. If any of that is happening, that is a strong indicator that something else is going on, that something is not resolved. And sometimes we get so conditioned in these ways, we get so conditioned in these ways of being, that we don't even recognize. We think that it's part of our character. We think that well, that's just how I am, you know, or that's just how I do, or I don't rock with people like that, or But that's not normal. That's not healthy. It might be normal for you, but that's not healthy. That's not God's will for your life. God never meant us to struggle in isolation. Like literally in Genesis, God looked at Adam and said, it's not good for man to be alone. Like, this is not a good situation. So I'm going to create, the Bible literally says, a helper for him. And so many of us, because we've experienced traumas and we're not able to vocalize those traumas, or we're not able to have a shoulder to lean on and didn't have anywhere to turn, it's hard for us to recognize help, or even to trust help when it's offered. And so I want to encourage my people, mi gente, I want to encourage you to take a look at the signs and the patterns in your life that might be inconsistent with wholeness and walking in integrity. And when I say integrity, I mean like in one piece. Okay, many of us are kind of walking around in broken pieces, or why we find it hard to believe in ourselves, or why we struggle with self-confidence, or why we're always fearful. Those are signs that something else is going on. And I don't think that this is just unique to Black people, but the reason why I started from that place is because I've seen this play out so many times in our culture, and we have an opportunity to break that cycle. We have an opportunity to break those demons of shame and judgment and suffering, to protect the misdeeds of other people, which allows it to continue. We have an opportunity to break those generational cycles and curses of toxicity that so many of us are still suffering from. Now, if you grew up in a happy, healthy family and the dynamics were great, that's awesome. But for so many of us, that's just not the case. We're walking wounded. And I just wanted to use this episode to really advocate for us to speak out, to reach out, and be proactive in finding the resources that are going to facilitate healing. So I hope this makes sense, and I hope you don't think I'm crazy. In fact, I would appreciate it if you know what I'm talking about or you can relate to this in some way. Make sure that you drop a comment down below, because it's time for us to start having this conversation. That's what we're doing on the Whole and Complete podcast. So I will make sure that I put a link down there so that you can check it out and understand where I'm coming from. But my goal, my life goal, is to positively impact the lives of 1 million+ people. And I know that that's a lofty goal, but with the tools, like things like social media and the technology that's readily available, I believe that's 100% possible. And my platform is not just limited to African Americans, but this is something that I feel so deeply and strongly about, something that I see happening in my community, and it hurts me to see it because I used to be in that place. But for the past year, I've been constant and consistent in therapy, constant and consistent in prayer. And I will tell you this, as much as I love the Lord, I can have Jesus and I can have my therapist. It's not one or the other. It's not, oh, don't you pray? I do pray. And the answer to that prayer was the therapist that I have in my life right now. So that's one of those things that it's like, wait a minute, you're telling somebody the business? Yes, I am. And in that place is where I found empathy. In that place is where I found peace and no judgment and safety, and a place where I could be able to share things and examine things and heal from things that I have been carrying for way too long. And I want that same thing for you. Even if therapy is not possible, there's a lot of free resources available. I will post some of those links down in the description. But if you find yourself, can recognize yourself in the signs that I talked about, in the suffering in silence, or you see this dynamic in your culture, I sincerely urge you to use this opportunity to stop that cycle, to turn it around so that we're not continuing to pass this down to the next generation. So that's all I got for this episode. I hope that you found value in it. I hope that you found peace in it. I hope that you found confirmation and validation in it, that you're on the right path. Whenever people find things like this, I always say it's not an accident. God is not an accidental God. He's very intentional, and he loves you enough to want you to be whole and complete. And I do too. So if you have any questions, comments, takeaways, make sure that you leave your comments down below. I'll also leave the links to my social media, and I will see you next time.